Hello everyone, I'm Becky Goldsmith with Piece of Cake. I want to show you how I prepare a quilt for either hand quilting or quilting on my long arm that sits in a table. And this would work with quilting at a home machine as well. I thread baste because I don't like those silly little basting pins. So I thread baste, about every 5 to 6 inches apart, horizontally and vertically. I always add a line of basting stitches at the edge of the quilt top, just inside that 1/4 inch mark. That will be that raw edge that will be included in the binding when the binding is attached. Then I take my big scissors, my big shears, and I trim the batting 1/2 inch to 1 inch away from the edge of the quilt top. And then I trim the backing about the same amount. Once I've got all of that trimmed, I fold the raw edge of the backing fabric over the exposed batting so that the raw edges of the top and the backing fabric meet. And then I baste the backing in place over the exposed batting. Now what that does is protect the outer edge of the quilt. It keeps it from stretching and fraying as you are doing your quilting. It also keeps all that batting dust from ending up all over your room. So that's how I prepare a quilt for quilting. Then, once I have a quilt quilted, I take the top and lay it over my cutting mat, and I place a ruler over it and trim away the backing and the batting, leaving 1/4 inch of backing and batting outside the edge of the quilt top. So you can see here, there's the edge of the quilt top, there's batting and there's backing. By leaving this attached and not trimming it off, even with that raw edge, this is what fills my binding and keeps it from being flat way out at the edge of the quilt. And I almost always use 2.5 inch cut binding that's then doubled and sewn to the quilt and doubled over. And this amount nicely fills the binding. All right, then the little trick, the beginning and ending trick that I've used forever and ever and ever when I bind a quilt. Okay, so you've got your binding, whether it's straight or bias, and you've got that 1/4 inch, or sorry, not 1/4, 45-degree angle cut in the beginning edge. I fold that over and press about 3/8 inch to create a nice folded edge here. Then I pin the leading edge of that down, and I pin this down, and then I pull the binding over and put a pin about here, and then I begin sewing the binding down at this part, and I leave, so you can see my hand, that's, I don't know, maybe 6 inches. So I move over about 6 inches, and then I sew the binding to the quilt itself. Look at the raw edges. The raw edges of the binding are even with the quilt top. What that means is when I do finish this and fold it over to sew that to the back, that extra backing and batting nicely fills the binding. Okay, so back to this. So I've attached I'm sewing this down, and I use a walking foot when I do this. I always use a walking foot, because if you use just a regular straight foot, it can push all the layers forward as you sew. Now, let me pick this up again. When I'm sewing, I stop this line of stitches 1/4 inch from the corner and back stitch. Then I take the quilt out of my machine, and to turn that corner, you fold the binding straight up, just like that, and then you fold the binding straight down, just like that, just like that. Binding up, binding down, and then you can begin sewing right again here with your 1/4 inch seam allowance, measured from the edge of the quilt top and the edge of the binding. When you're ready to turn the corners, you trim away that excess batting and backing right there at the corner and do your mitered fold the way you would if you didn't have that excess out there. Now, when you get back to the beginning, let's pretend like I've sewn all the way around here and I'm coming back to the beginning with my binding. When you get here, trim the binding so that it's a little bit longer. I don't know, maybe 1/2 inch longer than that edge of that fold, right? So I want to do it to there. Then I would pin, take this pin out, put it there, and I would open up this fold. I'm going to take that pin out for a minute. Would open up this fold, scoot that inside there, and you can use a tool to make sure this goes together nicely. Fold that over. Put in a pin to hold all your layers together, and then you just sew it all down. And you might think that having this fabric folded over like that it would be bulky in your quilts, but I tell you what, nobody ever sees it in my quilts. So once it's sewn and I fold the binding to the front, that raw fold that isn't, no, it's not a raw edge, it's a folded edge that hasn't been sewn yet, I just whip stitch it closed as I'm sewing down my binding. And that is the easiest, simple way I know of to begin and end your binding. So I hope you have enjoyed this tutorial, and may you go forth and bind happily. Many happy stitches. Thanks for watching.